Hi, good morning, good afternoon, good evening. This is Devashish Chatterjee from ITC Infotech. I welcome you to the first Customer Connect session. The topic of our discussion today is relevance of data pre and post COVID era. I see some of our guests have, a few of our guests have already joined. Maybe we should give a couple more minutes for a few more guests to join our session today, and then we'll kick off the session. We wait for few more of our guests to join in, trickle in. Let me introduce my co-host in the session today, Shaleen Gopal. Shaleen is a data science manager from APSA Group. Shaleen, welcome to the session.
Thank you, DC. Thank you for having me. And thank you to ITC Infotech as well for hosting this discussion point. Looking forward to it.
Shaleen, it's our pleasure. It's absolutely our pleasure to have you as my panelist for this session. I'm sure we are going to have very interesting conversations. I think we have around, I see around 48, close to 50, I think good enough to get started. We'll kick off the session. What can I say? That COVID has become the new normal, as most of the advisory firms are calling it. And its impacts are being seen globally across businesses and industry. Fundamentally, as I see it, Shaleen, it has changed the world as we know it. You see, people are living differently, buying differently, and in many ways thinking differently as well. Consumers across the globe are looking at products, brands through a new lens. It's almost the virus is reshaping the industry in real time, rapidly accelerating long-term underlying trends in the space in the mere weeks that are there. I mean, I know across the globe, some of the countries have started opening up, trickling in, but really the sentiments of the consumer is what has dramatically changed. And again, in real time in a rapid way. Shireen, what do you think is the impact what do you see as a leader of data science as the impact that is there because of the COVID scenario in different parts of the world, and even in from the part where you belong from?
No, thank you, DC. And you hit the nail on the head. COVID being faceless, we can't see it, we can't touch it, but we know it's there. It's not like a war where you hear guns going off and things being blown up and seeing the rampage that it causes. COVID seems to be a faceless pandemic. It's everywhere. And the impact on social and economic behaviors is going to be felt for a long, long time to come. Before I touch on your question, one of the interesting things, as I'm sure all of us have experienced globally, is how our behaviors have changed. Think about it. Pre-COVID, we got into our cars in the morning, sat in a bit of a traffic or long bit of traffic, get to the office, sitting in an open plan space, go from one meeting to the next. And we just carried on living lives, come back home, sort out the family, and get on with it. And what we found now with COVID is it's literally changed our environmental landscape. You would have also seen that there are reports on rivers, lakes, streams all running clearer because of the reduction of pollution. Air pollution has also been reduced. The interesting thing is data as it currently stands, and I would very much like to set this context, is data right now is a new currency. It's not something we used to talk about or go to seminars and conferences about. The data is what is driving all of our decision making. And this data allows for the unique insight on how governments, corporations, citizens alike should actually report to respond to this COVID pandemic. And as data scientists or people in the data fraternity, our job is to analyze and interpret this data the best way we know how. The pebble I'm going to drop in all of our audience's pond is, have you ever wondered what the whole thing about track and trace is? For the longest time, we all own a smartphone or a cell phone. We have couple hundred apps on it. And what we found as a result of it is those apps have location, GPS coordinates, and with the partnering up of mobile network operators with various countries and governmental organizations and health departments to try and fight this pandemic, there's new discussions around privacy, regulation. Me as the consumer, have I authorized you to use this? Do I even want you to know, or want you to notify me whether I'm in a high risk area or not? Those data points are becoming ever so critical. And what we're finding currently, DC, is that in this pandemic, you have the world of medical science, and then you've got what I call the sciences and data, right? Both are equally important, but both are fundamentally dangerous during this time. And people are both looking into it, both medically and from a data hat, and how this entire pandemic is affecting us and will affect us, and how it could affect us going forward. But it's important because the knowledge of science can give you power, and the power to change the world, and the power to change fundamentally not our world, but the world's in its holistic sense. And it's dangerous because a little bit of knowledge should still keep us a little bit humble. Because us in data, we are hungry for information. We want to understand it. It's tempting. We want to keep on peeling away the onion. And we also get a bit boisterous and show off that knowledge. But there's a certain level of uncertainty in this time, because as dangerous as it is, we may have people with a lot of knowledge, and they can be pressed for decisions, even when the information doesn't make sense. So it's this time right now where the relevance of data, especially during this pandemic, can be very confusing, because people will want to draw inference and make certain assumptions, especially in a very high pressurized situation, and what we should do and what we shouldn't do, and the misinterpretations around that. So there are a lot of moving parts in this instance. Sorry for that long-winded approach.
No, that's a wonderful perspective you bring in. And Shalane, I must say, for us, the data professionals, every new data point is jewel. I mean, it's an aspect that you look for, trying to mine it, trying to correlate it. And we will get into the discussions and the points around privacy and regulations that you have clearly highlighted as areas that needs to be considered given what's going around. But however, I just want to get a view from you is, how do you see what might be the key tenets to thrive in this new normal, or if we consider this as a new normal and what's happening? I mean, I'm sure all of us do agree it has been a black swan event, and there has been a lot of nervousness, and everything around us is dramatically changing. So
yeah.
Any suggestions, any point of views on what really needs to be looked at? What might be few of the directional things that we can think of doing to revive in this era?
Yeah, there's a couple of things, DC, that we need to consider and we shouldn't overlook. Let's be honest, we are a human race that are social beings. So the impacts on our individual capacities have severely been strained, both from a mental standpoint, anxiety, balancing of family, work life. It's taken this idea of work-life balance to a whole new different dimension that's never been explored, because now suddenly you have parents that are now the teacher and also the employee and the manager, which leads me to the next point, where leadership has significantly been redefined and reinvented literally overnight. Your HR processes from a corporate perspective, if you look at it on how do I engage my employee, let's take it a little bit further and think about how do I actually still maintain the trust of my client and my customer? Is online still considered safe? How do I comply with the governmental policies and regulations around privacy and data, and how do we use it? What data to use? Where does it become unethical? Where does it become too scary to be using it at the edge of that forefront? All the while fighting a faceless pandemic, because we don't know how it's going to play out. And at the end of the day, you want to maintain a certain level of productivity because the economy still needs to carry on. At the same time, how do you respond faster, but with the limited and maybe misinterpreted information to make those decisions quicker? How do I make sure that I don't lose touch with my valuable customer and client and still let them know I'm here? Whereas in this economy, a lot of companies are also closing down. So how do you balance all of this in a space that is taking us to new frontiers every single day? So where we may very nonchalantly say it's a new normal, it's a new normal that's being redefined every day. And one of the key things is the remote working, the remote contact, the touchless interaction with our consumer and our employees is becoming ever more critical. And that's being redefined every single day. So the tenets that we are looking at here are coming in not just from one variable perspective, but it's from a multitude, and making sure it's a balancing act that we can maintain, because it has to be sustainable, because we don't know how long COVID's going to be around for, if that makes sense.
Absolutely, absolutely. And you touch upon some very interesting points in your narration, and I'll just quickly call them out. You are highlighting how leadership itself has changed or changing, and how leaders really need to react into this situation to be able to, or be able to take the right decision to move forward. You brought up a very important aspect of online. Is it safe? And then I think the whole aspect of security in the digital world needs to be considered. You touched upon ethical, whether it is ethical or not. How do we take quicker decisions at this point of time and merge it? And quite frankly, Shalene, as I see it, I mean, many businesses see digital technologies as a silver lining in the new normal,
Correct.
as just a avenue to just survive and revive what's happening. Digital absolutely plays a critical role, but the aspects that you have brought in on the security aspect, the safety aspects, your ability to take the have the right leadership to be able to take the right decision faster, are going to be fundamentally defining aspects as we move forward into this so-called new normal. Now, well before the crisis, many businesses pursued digital transformation, as you know, Shalene, programs to both define themselves against competitive disruption and leverage superior functionality from the digital business models as well. To bring in more scalability, more productivity, you have your new digital solutions really geared up to provide that value to the business. Now, including AI and every analytics, bit of analytics to really drive some of the continuous intelligence at scale to drive this. But the question I have for you is, given what has happened, the way things have changed around the consumer behaviors, which are changing, and obviously the need for an architecture to be really almost real time at this point of time. Do you see there are certain breaks? I mean, this pandemic is going to potentially put some break into the digital transformation, or the companies should actually should accelerate it for future growth?
That's an interesting question, DC, because what you'll also notice during this time, it's not about putting the brakes or going too fast. Digital has always, like data, been on everyone's strategy scorecard at some point or the other. And at the end of last year, I'm almost certain that a lot of strategies as going into this new decade would have been, we have to focus on data, we have to focus on digital, we have to focus on making our business a little bit more leaner, saving costs. But what a lot of our companies, be it retailers, large banks, did not cater for is this pandemic. And what you would have found is there's a certain acceleration of certain strategies. Like I mentioned, I would have imagined a lot of companies would have thought really long and hard and wanted to think this and plan it out to the nth degree about remote working. But what did we find? In a span of a couple of weeks, in a span of a couple of days in certain parts of the country, remote working became a reality, where everyone had to actually lock down because that's what the pandemic called for. Now you're looking at the next phase of it is, how do we keep our workforce? How do we save jobs? How do we cut our costs? We're not operating in a way that you can make profits and turnovers and revenues like we normally would. Our targets no longer apply. Why? Because we have regulation from a governmental and a World Health Organization that says, well, I'm sorry, your industry can't operate, which means now you've got to find other cost-saving mechanisms while balancing and maintaining the heartbeat of the economy and your company. So where do you look? You look at physical servers. Do we renew building leases? How do we save the jobs? How do we make sure that leave can be taken? How do we ensure that pay cuts are not going to cripple family households, etc., etc. At the same time, you found a deceleration of, I think, certain deliverables. So it's a reprioritization of priorities, but focusing on the right bigger ones, because in order to move forward, we have to look at it holistically. And it's not just from a digital perspective, but it's now asking the question, what do we need to do to make sure that we have a digital presence, that we are online, that my customer knows that I haven't closed doors, that I'm still here, I can still provide my product? How do those ecosystems now evolve or reinvent themselves in a way that's going to be meaningful for a constrained COVID environment?
Absolutely. One thing which has really happened for sure, I believe the consumer has really become anxious at this point, and that has really, the restrictions have lifted, the pockets across the countries, the spendings are returning back. However, the consumer behavior begins to adopt to the next normal. Uh, there is focus on, obviously, the focus on savings and for the uncertainty which is there. There's a level of work-life balance that you mentioned. So there is tremendous focus on the consumer, and things are bound to change. My question to you, Shalini, is as a data science leader, do you see the relevance of the data points, I mean, which we were as data professionals were looking into to mine the jewels within the data? Do you really see the relevance changing pre and post COVID? If yes, what is the most relevant thing according to you, and which areas are the most relevant ones?
So at this time, DC, one of the things you'll know is a lot of industries across industries are looking at their own data firstly. They're looking at the quality of it. They're looking at the accuracy and the completeness of it. Something that may have at one point overlooked or sat in an operational scorecard is now at the forefront. But in addition to that, like I mentioned, like with our track and trace initiatives that we hear about globally, is you'll notice that the overlaying of data becomes important. It's not just about connecting the data points to get a model prediction. It's not about just getting an output to react to it anymore. It's about the quality of it and what we're actually trying to solve for. You touched on machine learning and AI. Now, we know that history is, and being a fellow data scientist, you'd appreciate this, data massaged too much will always give you what you're looking for. So you've got to be careful, okay? We have to understand the underlying data and what we are trying to solve for. So when it comes to the use of data, historic data is just merely a guideline. It is better to change the future than to predict the future. So what do I mean by this? A lot of companies have in the past built a lot of models or even went out and bought a lot of machine learning systems, but they lacked the in-house know-how, experience needed to maintain and retrain these models. And the retraining of the model requires the human touch, the human intervention. So the current crisis has also shown that things can get worse before it actually gets better. Because if you think about your training sets and your test sets of your data, if you think about it, if we have models that didn't take into account things like freak events, you know, like the Great Depression, 9/11, Black Monday stock market crash in 1987, the financial crisis in 2008. These are all triggers that are perfect to build machine learning models. But you can't prepare for everything. And if a machine learning system doesn't see what it's expecting to see, guess what? We're going to have problems, which is where we find ourselves. Now, with the whole concept of artificial intelligence and machine learning, there's algorithms that run behind. If you think about it, machine learning models are trained on the normal human behavior, or are now finding out that what is the new normal? How do these models actually react? And how bad the situation is depends on who you talk to. Where's the data for all of this? What's clear is what's uncovering right now from everything that I've uncovered is the pandemic is revealing how intertwined our lives are with AI, exposing the codependence in which it changes to our behavior and how AI works, and how the changes to AI works with our behavior. We can't think and where that whole concept of, oh no, you've got a machine learning model or you've got an AI model that's running there, don't worry, forget about it. No, it doesn't really work like that. Machine learning models are designed to respond to changes, but mostly they are fragile. They perform badly when input data differs too much from the data they were trained on. It is a mistake to actually assume that once you set it up, you can just walk away from it. And this typical example, I think, will resonate with a lot of our audience is, think about when the pandemic was announced. We saw parts of the world raced out and did what? They went out and they stockpiled. But what did they stockpile on? They stockpiled on things like groceries, toilet paper, sanitizers. Now, what did that do with the supplier ecosystem and the inventory models that were actually running? Suddenly your models don't know what to do because you're seeing these spikes out of the blue. There's no data points that said, guess what, this is coming. It happened literally overnight. Also, in terms of consumer spend and the forecasting and your prediction models are not reacting like how they should, because there was no historic data points that determined how this was actually going to work. So the news is not all doom and gloom. It's just a matter of understanding what we have can safely work with in order to make sure that whatever advice we put forward is not going to be so severely skewed that you're going to take decisions that will take you far out from from your road map, so to speak. So from an AI and a machine learning perspective and a data perspective, I say it's a very dangerous time, but the opportunity is there. If we can balance and hit the sweet spot of understanding the different data points versus our internal company information and what's externally available, overlay it in a safe manner, I think we should be okay. So when I say external data, things like population, things like population density, the demographics of that particular area, the buying patterns of that area. You touched on earlier, how is our consumers actually spending their money? It's interesting because you would actually know that a lot of our consumers are not going to lines of credit. Why? Because they're scared. They don't know if they're going to get a job. Credit is expensive, so we might as well dip into our savings or our check accounts and see how far we can actually stretch that. So there's a lot of sporadicness that's actually real. And these data points, I think, in hindsight, will make a little bit more sense. But as we navigate here and now through the storm, it's about being careful and making sure that we are not too hasty to act on information half-baked, so to speak.
No, very nice. I mean, I think the last summarization or how you concluded your views is really nice. I mean, I believe the current situation is also opening up opportunities for us to really have a capability which allows you to simulate multiple scenarios and hence learn more. As you rightly pointed out, your supply chain models are no longer valid because they are now completely looking into new data sets which they have not been trained on. But before we deep dive further, I think it's a time. Let's see what our audience feel about. There's a quick. It's a poll time, and audience, I'll request you to give your view. It's a quick 50 seconds, 5 questions. What is your top digital transformation investment area in the new normal? Personalization, Shireen, I believe the options that are there are personalization, advanced analytics, cloud core, which is really on the modernization side of it, intelligent automation or conversational channels for engagement. I would assume that the engagement channels would come out as a top priority. What do you think, Shalin?
I know these are interesting, DC. I'm kind of bouncing between the advanced analytics, personalization of experiences, but more importantly, the cloud for core modernization. Cloud is taking us by storm, whether it is Amazon, Azure, they are really emerging as the cost efficiencies that companies have been looking for. So if you want to replace your physical servers, this is where it potentially is going to be. There we go. It's interesting, DC. The poll has actually come out whereby we see advanced analytics for insights is at 24%. Cloud for core modernization 24. Is at, sorry, go for it.
Yeah, 24%. Sorry, go ahead. Yeah,
24%, and cloud for core modernization is at 29%. And then we see a kind of an even spread, conversational channels for engagement, intelligent automation, and personalization of experiences at 14%. So that's quite interesting, because I think we are also trying to figure out in these strategies, how do we actually personalize enough to make sure that we remain relevant and efficient. And it's interesting to see the feedback from our audience, because it's going to be a juggling act as to what that sweet spot actually is.
Absolutely. And I'll quickly switch back from on the aspect of how all about the consumer and how the consumer is anxious given the current situation. And we did get good enough input from the audience saying that advanced analytics, I believe that was the topmost choice of 24%, or no, it's the cloud modernization, which is at 29%. But Shalin, the question I have for you is, we are talking about personalization, we are talking about recommendation, which are core data science models. Given that it is changing, is there really a method to recalibrate them? I mean, we are now all aware that there is new data points which is coming in. There needs to be an area or a capability for simulating and understanding that data. How do you really recalibrate these models, and what might be the right way of moving forward?
In this instance, it's about, you have to rapidly validate your models, creating the new data sets, enhancing and tweaking the features that you are actually modeling on. And it's about understanding what those risks are in those financial models, or in any kind of your models that you're actually building. But it's, if you think about how our marketing actually happens, right? At one point, your customer used to walk into your store. That was easy enough because you could actually look at foot traffic and you can see how many people are coming through your door, your new customer versus your returning customer. Now, all of a sudden, you've got to understand what's your online play to see how many of those new returning customers are actually coming via your online store. So what is that support? What does your model actually tell you? Your marketing strategies have actually changed because you don't have the same foot traffic or the same type of traffic, either walking at bus stations or taxi ranks, or at tuk-tuk stops. You actually don't have the same number of cars on the road anymore. So how does your marketing actually change? So suddenly your variables are becoming different. It's not stuff you would normally scenario plan on. And in many instances right now, at the top of the forefront, yes, it's a part of personalized experience. I'm going to ask many of you, how many of you have actually considered going to the shop, but you leave your family at home? It's about going to the shop. It's about your safety. It's about making sure you get your bare necessities and you leave. At the same time, when it comes to managing our finances, where we normally would have predicted, okay, this is the products that people would likely take, or this is how they would likely invest, that's not the case right now. So right now, we are looking at it from multiple perspectives, and it's about overlaying it in a way that's going to give you the best insight for your business for tomorrow. And it's about understanding where the new volumes are coming from. How do you manage it? How do you forecast? And how do you actually maintain that level of delivery, as well as giving the same level of service that you aspire to in your company. So the personalization strategy here to engage customers in that high anxiety environment and to make sure that it's safe is really challenging, because I can personally say, looking at all of the different variables that are coming out right now, you've got to have to ask yourself, because I have access to this information, should I be doing this? Let's go back. Let me understand and reassess what it is that I'm trying to solve for. So recalibration is requiring a lot more effort than it normally would on your traditional normal, so to speak, DC.
But that also, I will open it up for a quick poll and check with the audience over here. While we are talking about recalibration, what are the typical analytical use cases that really need to be reprioritized at this point of time? I mean, you have segmentation models, you have personalization models, you have core recommendation engines, which needs to be relooked at. There are definitely risk assessment areas that needs to be looked at. There are models which look into risk, and as well as the scenario. I mean, I would imagine scenario planning being the number one. What's your view? Because scenario planning, according to me, will really give you the opportunity to play around and understand different aspects of the new data which is coming in.
I think scenario planning would feature, but I strongly believe the risk assessment and the recommendations is where a lot of the focus is going to come to, is because let's look at it from the track and trace side of it. It's about understanding how useful is smartphone location data overlaid with your company information, where you and I, as a mobile network operator, I may not know, I have a lot of information about, sorry, I'm going to interrupt myself here. There we go. Interesting to see. The top two is scenario planning at 43% and risk assessment at 30%, followed by personalization, recommendations, and segmentation. And that's very interesting. So when you look at risk assessment on this one, like I mentioned, with cell phone data, when we start looking at this and we start overlaying it, even like with banks data, it becomes a very dangerous space, because where your mobile network operator has information about you, there are other data sources that can tell you, hey, the ID of these phones, because every single one of our smartphones has an ID, these are your movements, these are the pandemic areas you've been, this is the kind of activity you've been exposed to. And that also creates a different level of scenarios. So how many scenarios are we going to actually overlay, and can you do it in isolation of just your company, whether it's a retail, whether it's a bank, whether it's an insurance company, whether it's the car industry? How many scenarios are they going to be overlapping in order to make sure that what you're putting out for your customer is relevant? I think that's going to be very tricky in actually meeting those analytical or meeting those needs.
Absolutely. I mean, it's going to be definitely a combination of scenario planning and the risk assessment. Our guests have correctly identified the top two priorities. Before Shalin and I, we open up to the broader audience and take their questions, I do have one more question to ask you, Shalin. When we started the conversation around digital and what is next and how digital transformation needs to be should speed up at this point of time, you did touch upon contactless solutions. If you look at it from a customer intelligence or a customer profile standpoint and contextualizing touchless experiences, how do you see what might be some of the typical solutions which might be important at this point of time, and we should be looking at developing such solutions much rapidly and faster?
On that, you'll see the touchless side of it. I think many of us globally would have experienced this a lot in the education sector, right? So it's about taking learning to the smart device, whether it's your laptop, whether it's your cell phone. When you look at the data side of it and how you can actually make sure that our platforms are up to scratch, yes, it's about understanding that it's not about the software that is actually confined in a certain way that has to be configured in a waterfall approach. It's about trying to figure out where those opportunities are with the open source tools that are out there. enriching your data attributes a little bit more frequently. It's not about just having the data that's just unsupervised, leave it there, let's see how and when we can actually figure out when to use it, when to enrich it. It's about plotting it and understanding it in a way that's meaningful enough that can actually make sure that our contactless ways, whether it's via bots, in most instances, what some of the surveys that I've also read is, even though companies are defaulting to AI-powered bots, humans, because of their anxious state, actually want to hear a human voice on the other side, actually wants to get that level of comfort, because they're not out and about like they normally would. And like I originally started off saying, we are social beings. We don't know how to stay put. We don't know how to stay confined in our own homes and in our own spaces. And now when you reach out for help, whether it is in any of your industry, it's about knowing that, how do I make sure that it's as human as possible? How is it relevant? And how do I actually get some bits of data that's going to help me deal with this customer better the next time around? And how do I keep on refining it?
Absolutely. So, in essence, if I may to summarize, and I'll request you to give your points as well on some of the key takeaways from me, I think it is all going to be about gaining the customer trust back, uh, doing a level of prioritization, which is going to be extremely important at this point of time. But we need to develop faster sense and respond kind of capabilities, which will really touch upon the real-time architectures, which are going to be absolutely important for organizations to give that experience back, gain the momentum back. Cognitive and automated operations are being going to get considered, and obviously, and from a data standpoint, the data models definitely need to be recalibrated. I will let you summarize, Shanine, and give your point of view, some of the
Okay, thank you, DC.
Go
So,
ahead, please.
okay, so DC, there's a couple of things we've touched on. Data is really important right now, more important than it was yesterday or at the end of last year's strategies going into 2020. But I'm going to caution and say this very humbly. Data is not everything. Data plus a whole lot of knowledge can definitely help. And that is going to be the balancing and secret act for us to navigate during this COVID period. So right now, data is both power and powerful, and the balance is about using it in the right and responsible manner for the greatest good and outcome for all of us. In addition to this data side of it, is also bringing to the forefront a new kind of leadership that shows the awareness and the vulnerability that our leaders need to display in order to deal with our customer, deal with our employees and our staff in an empathetic and a compassionate way, because this sets the platform, I believe, to business recovery in what you consider the new normal in this COVID era. So it's going to be a combination of a lot of facets that will have to be played out very carefully in the days to come.
Wonderful. With that, I will open it up for Q&A. I mean, I believe we have another 5 to 10 minutes to take few questions. And just to remind our audience, after the question, just after the Q&A session, there is a survey. Please do participate in the survey. We are anxiously waiting to get your inputs. So I will open the forum for questions. Any questions from the audience? I do see some questions popping in. Maybe Shalane, I will ask you to perhaps respond to the question. And the first question is, which areas companies need to invest at this point in?
Can you hear me at this
I am
time?
sorry, I just have some issues. Yeah,
No
please
problem.
go ahead, Shalane.
Can you please perhaps repeat that question, please? It has not come up on my side.
Yes, the question is, which areas companies need to invest in to thrive in the new normal?
I think it's going to be in a couple of areas. In the world of efficiencies and automations, what do you choose to automate? Your quality of your data, cleanliness and accuracy, emphasis has to be invested in there if that's going to be your key input driver, and where you source this information from, as well as your strategies on how to cost save and survive the next coming days and months. So it's a matter of, do you renew building leases, or do you rather carry on working remotely because it's working right now? Your employee and your staff is productive. Do you move your physical servers and literally make the call and say, right, let's have a strategy to move to the cloud. It works out cheaper. There's going to be a number of areas that have to be factored and considered into where that money is invested. And above all, how do you maintain mental well-being of your staff and your customers going forward in this uncertain time?
Thank you so much, Shalane. That was wonderful. We'll just wait for about a minute more and see if there are any questions. I sincerely would request our guests to participate in the survey, and the link is available down there. And thank you so much for joining us in this. I hope this session was useful. And Shalane, thanks a lot for being the co-panelist in this session. Thank you so much.
No, thank you, DC. And while we're waiting for a couple more questions, I think it also needs to be explored that even though we may be operating in a time of crisis, it is also a time of opportunity on how business can be done innovatively and creatively, how it is a fertile environment for new businesses to be created. And I'm really eager and interested to see what the future may hold. Right now, it may look like doom and gloom for a lot, but the opportunities are definitely there. And it'll be interesting to actually see what comes out of this era. I think history will judge us exactly on what we do now. So it will definitely be interesting.
Absolutely. Thanks a lot, Shalane. Thank you, friends. Thanks for joining the webinar. I think we are just on time. Thanks for joining us today. Thank you.
And thank you very much, DC, for having me, and to ITC Infotech. I really hope this has been informative. It's a wonderful topic, and look forward to the other topics to come. Have a wonderful afternoon.
You too, Shalane. Thank you.